First, thanks for coming. I didn't know that this is my show. Yeah, usually, usually it's the show of my friend. But just that you be aware, when I think there was never a public debate I ever had with you on a personal basis. Yeah, but what you shouldn't forget, Jeff was a very important person for me in let's say 20 years ago because he did something to me that because that you have to understand is, for him, I regained love to architecture. Okay, so and I have to be thankful for that. So I thought, of course, what should I show? Should I show them something, the debate we have within the research studio of the Edge City, yeah? Or do I have to show something that he is a real expert of? And I thought I'll show you two things that I hope comes once into your collection of expertise, yeah? Because I think he is very good in windows, yeah? And in buildings that produce statums, yeah? So I found two projects, two images for you that I would like to debate, but I think in order to debate them, you should understand the idea what these two images do to me, or did to me, questions basically what is the contemporary architectural practice today. So the first thing is I found a window for you, since I know that that I think you showed me really what a window could be. This is a window that I was recently built in Innsbruck, yeah? And what is interesting is it has nothing of the features that you once told me a window should have, yeah? You cannot look outside, yeah? It doesn't let air in, you cannot open it by yourself, it does it whenever it wants to open it. But the interesting thing of the window is that when I ask someone, who designed that, you know? Then someone said, well, this is not for humans, this is for the building. So I got really interested in this idea that suddenly there's an architectural feature to which we had made a discourse, yeah, in the relationship of the human subjectivity in relationship to that window, yeah, and suddenly there's a window not for humans, or at least not in that sense. So I found it interesting that the author of that window is suddenly a building. Having said that, I have another image for you. This is my absolutely favorite project. The first time I saw a building literally becomes the ground for a city. Yeah? And the interesting thing is, why it's interesting to me is because every idea that I learned from you, or any political idea of understanding the ground in relation to the object, had something to do with either the performance of, in a certain way, of capitalism or within the relationship of power. Now, what I found interesting in here is this is a project within communist capitalism, which means there must be a different idea of what you can own or what you cannot own, yeah? And it has produced this diagram. And so, in that sense, that I wanted to show you these two things because what they have done to me is more or less than something else. It meant to re-look into readings of architecture in which I sort of tried to figure out how did we ever look at the city, yeah, as a kind of author for architecture. And so that, you know, these two images intrigue then the kind of series of, let's say, lectures that I give within the research program or within that project, which then shows into this idea, how have we ever thought, yeah, that architecture gains its knowledge, yeah, from the city, yeah, and rather in our interpretations. Now with that, I hope it would be great to talk with you about these two things. If you can, then I have something else, yeah? I can keep on going. I know. No, but I think, no, but,
Let me just say, back to your window. I would say that the evidence is very clear that at least half of your window is about humans, since there's a guardrail. So somebody is outside that window because they're being protected. So just because whoever the architect is had a specific function in mind for what the window is supposed to be doing in relationship to the building doesn't mean it's not doing all sorts of theoretical and architectural operations in addition to that. So these devices remain promiscuous. So no matter, and not only that, I can show you this window by Herzog in de Meuron at Laban and show how it's doing one thing. And I can show you this exact same window by Max Skagen and Merrill Elam in Columbus, and I can show you how it's doing something else. So this window is not a mechanical window operating simply on the basis of the building's desire to maintain and control its environmental systems as you would like it to be, showing the mechanism on the left. But you cannot subjugate the architecture to any specific disciplinary or functional or mechanical, you can't. So it's going to constantly construct new subjectivities. In this particular case, quite smartly, I think, an interrupted relationship to nature, and the casual condition of the handrail and the step on the outside. They're all doing the kind of work that more thoughtful architecture or architect, and I believe you probably are doing this, would have choreographed into the combination of the quotidian everyday interests of the energy requirements and the urban requirements with the poetic and philosophical requirements. So it's quite a profound window, I think.
Oh, yeah, no. I totally agree, it's profound, but the two things that I found interesting about all that is what I have learned from you by giving me the world of windows is you gave me always two things. You described the window as a form, meaning it frames something, yeah? But in the way of framing, it politicized something as well.
Absolutely.
And what I found interesting in that window, I think it becomes my thesis, is the window loses its formal capacity to frame something, and it also loses the content of what a window usually had to be politicized. It politicized something else. So to me, this is what I see the interest in the window. It doesn't belong anymore in terms of content and form to that what we usually have.
But in the United States, for example, you first see these windows as a catalog device in prisons. So,
oh, yeah. Oh, that's right.
So you can ride down the street and you can see a building at the corner of Alameda and whatever, and you will see the first appearance of these, an example of this exact window as a restricted view window in federal MCI. And so first time you see this kind of slot window catalog is in MCI. So anyway, go to your next slide.
Yeah.
And for me, I don't know, this says a lot about why it's probably a good enough idea these days to stop construction at the level of the rigid weatherproofing, you know. I mean, what we're looking at is not the finished buildings, but the right before they put the Tyvek on, that's rigid insulation, that yellow.
I know, these are buildings.
No, that's rigid insulation. Every place in this country and every place in the world, that's the layer they put right before they put the outside layer.
But you see, it also has little caravans driving. No, you see what I want.
So whether or not that's true, I'm just saying that looks better. I see this all the time, all over the country.
Yeah.
I see this state of the building, and I think, thank God. And then I know they're going to put some idiotic veneer on the top of it, and I just say, why don't they just leave it alone? That's this thing right now. Let's say this is rigid insulation. Okay, this beautiful yellow. And let's say this is the layer underneath the roof. This is the best architecture you could possibly get at the moment. Whatever they put on top of it is not going to do any wall work whatsoever. All it's going to do is stop the bird from poking a hole in this thing. That's its only job, is to stop So look at this and recognize how good this is. And then recognize everything you do to this is just sucks.
But do you know actually what I wanted to tell you here? I mean, do you know what I wanted to say here? You told me there is no such thing as a ground, okay? There is only land, there's a metropolitan field, there's contact and so on.
You'll never
And I found the literacy of that image, that the Le Corbusier diagram, that the ground, the lost ground underneath the building becomes reproduced on the top, is not anymore a conceptual top, but a real urban fabric. Yep. I found enormously intriguing.
That was 20 years ago.
Yeah, who cares? But this is today. I mean, what I'm saying is this is a literally production of the city today. And I think I'm only saying this within the conceptualization of a building becoming a property, I think there is another architectural diagram at stake. And why I'm saying that is because...
Okay, what, Peter? I mean, what is the other architectural diagram?
Okay, I show you some projects.
Well, I mean, the thing about this, first of all, this is an extremely important diagram in the sense that the sense of the real and the irreal in this is every day. So is this village captured? In other words, are they in this courtyard? This is one development. Am I taking this correctly?
No, I think, I don't know. I don't even know the story. I think the story is like this. This is a shopping mall, and these are the labor people coming from, migrate into the city. Yeah, they need a living. Yeah, and they build literally a village on the roof.
On the roof of a shopping mall.
Of a shopping mall, yeah. And so this is a shopping mall, and on the roof of the shopping mall there is a city. But what I see here the first time is that the city gets literally reproduced within the building. And I think that's, to me, a radical diagram in the relationship of the history of capitalism and of urbanization. Because until now, we only understood either that the land belongs to me and I can build on the land. The land that belongs to us and we build collectively. This is the garden city. Or the state belongs to the land. We don't own anything, we just rent it. Yeah? And so I think in that history of the relationship of what a building means in relationship to ownership goes through, is this a new diagram that I haven't seen yet? And I would say that belongs to a communal form of capitalism that happens in China that we, I think, have met. Because you see, there are diagrams of that Koolhaas was always using for the repetition of the land for the high-rise building, but it was a kind of conceptual idea. This is, here, to me, it's the first time literally. So just to be able, you can buy now. I mean, if this is real, it means you can buy this piece of land and you have the rights to the same thing the large building would have on the ground. And I'm just saying there's something interesting happened to me that when you take it literally, it means that perhaps the relationship of what we have conceived so far, that there is something like land or ground, might vanish.
Well, there's a big difference between land and ground.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a big difference between land, ground, field, urban field, metropolitan field, cosmopolitan field. Now what you're saying is there's yet another adventure in this post-datum thing that is become an interface between real property and personal property, or intellectual property. You know, and the thing about it is whatever hooks in there becomes semi-permanent. I think it's very important. I mean, your students, you and I can have this conversation. Is it okay with you if I don't face you? Did I talk to Peter? And then, okay. So the basic issue that Peter and I are discussing is this. There are three kinds of property. There is personal property, there's real property, and as of 200 years ago, there's something become intellectual property. That's not really enough kinds of property, for one thing. But you should understand the differences between them, among them, and you should understand why architecture is so perilously and fascinatingly poised in that formula. The ground is called real property because it doesn't move. You can't pick up the ground and move it anywhere else. So anything that's got to do with the ground or that's attached to it so that it can't move, that's real property. No one actually can ever own real property. The only people that can, only person that can, or only thing, only institution that can own real property or govern real property is some governing institution, a state, a municipality. So you can own it, but you have to pay tax on it, which basically means you can't own it because you're going to run out of money eventually to pay taxes. That's the point. Literally, that's the point of taxes, which is why Warren Buffett says the greatest mistake we could ever make as a society is to not tax estates. So the idea that a family could get wealthy and then not have there be any burden on that wealth whatsoever to cause it to dissipate. So you could make $1 billion, Steve Jobs can make $1 billion, and there'd be nothing to ever stop that family from having $1 billion is a tragedy. So what we do is cause it to evaporate by taxes. So within 4 generations, that $1 billion is gone unless that family does something with it. So the taxation is crucial to stop it from being able to held in perpetuity without the production, without a productive relationship to it. So that's why in England, these ideas of freeholds, 1,000 and 10,000 year freeholds, which is a rental relationship between the land and the king, which they can then go on and give mortgage relationships, 100-year. So recently, we're old enough to go through the expiration of 1,000-year-old freeholds in England, and everybody had a crisis. So the land not being able to move and anything being attached to the land makes it real property, which is where we get real estate. Get that? Everything else that's property, like these, that's personal property. Personal property is something you can own in a different way that you can own real property. Now, the thing that's interesting about buildings is that they're the only object that we relate to as personal property that are in fact real property.
That's the point.
So that defines our social and intellectual and cultural relationship uniquely to architectural objects. And so all of the policy relationships between urbanism, architecture, architectural design, the rights of architecture come from this intense conflict between the actual objective governance of real property as made necessary by even a reasonable municipal organization and the psychology, sociologies of personal property. So I'll give you just a brief example in American law. The most liberal court in the history of American law was the Warren Supreme Court. It gave rights to everybody, prisoners, but they were the most egregiously conservative in terms of the rights of property owners over their houses. So at the same time, they put into motion something like, sorry, Peter, just going to be done in 1 second. So in 1 second, so when the Warren Court put in, for example, the Miranda rule, so when you got arrested, you got read your rights. So the rights they gave to criminals were unprecedented in the history of Western civilization since that big thing they did in England. What's that thing called? 600 years ago? Magna Carta. Yeah, okay. Is that until the Warren, the rights of your right to remain silent, all those rights, the right to an attorney, whether you could afford one or not. So this intense understanding of the rights of individuals as guaranteed by, in principle, by the Constitution, didn't apply when you owned land to your right over your land. So, for example, if you were part of a architectural association in a neighborhood, and that neighborhood had a rule against putting a sign up in your neighborhood, then, and you wanted to put a political sign up for an election, and the neighborhood had a rule against it, then freedom of speech didn't prevail because of the rights of a municipality or any kind of governments in relationship to real property and personal property. So freedom of speech is a personal right guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, doesn't apply. So this was a big deal. It's still, you hear it on the radio, what about my right to free speech? And the Warren Court still prevails. So this is a big deal. Every day you're going to hear this discussion. So when we're talking about this status in architecture, and architecture's intense 150-year interrogation of the tradition of the building and the ground as land, and why Le Corbusier wrote in a chapter in one of his books, Architecture or Revolution, is because architecture supported authority's relationship to the ground as land for a long time, whether it was priestly land, royalty land, as long as the authority of the king, of the church, was stated in the building's relationship to the land, there was stability, economic stability, cultural stability, power relationships. As soon as modernism started to interrupt that by trying to turn the land into more democratic or egalitarian forms like datum, field, that process began to destabilize. And that's when we started to see issues like the datum or the stage or the cosmopolitan field. So everything we're talking about now are new ways architects can attach a building to the ground in relationship to a cosmopolitan governance or an economic taxation policy system and try to maintain new forms of agility and mobility so that there is not this kind of oppressive stabilization of one authority system over that, but at the same time recognizes the personal and real property relationship. So that's what's going on in the whole conversation. Okay, does that help? There you go. Now, one more thing you should know is I am sick to death after 25 and of hearing myself talk. And I am sick to death of giving that fucking speech again and again and again and again and again. Everyone needs to know it. It's real easy. And it's what you're looking at and why Peter and I look at that and think, oh my God, that is an incredible thing to see. And I do not think any of the people that are involved in actually producing that have any idea what they're doing, which is even more interesting. You know? But we can come in, look at that, theorize that, pick that up, think about Hagen Island. We can think about what's going on, look at other projects, and then draw a diagram, which he's about to show us. There you go.
I think here comes, and I think that's what interests me is that in reality, in the production of contemporary reality, there are new diagrams embedded, you know, and that's I think is what that thing is to me. And secondly, why that is the case is another thing is because what once have been debated as the idea of the aggregated figure, yeah, suddenly to me had suddenly a real evidence, you know, a political real idea of its form, yeah, because of microphone. Because of that. So what I became now suddenly interesting is to look into reality again, you know, similar that probably Koolhaas did, similar that Rossi did and others, and see if I can unreveal, yeah, some kind of diagrams that relate to that. So what I have found, is for example, this thing in Atlanta last year, yeah, where literally you have the street as a plinth, or this one is in Istanbul, which is a fake island, yeah, constructing a generic tower. So if you once know the Rem Koolhaas captive globe, here we have the opposite. It's not anymore the generic grid that gives all our fantasies above. No, it's our generic life that gives the fantasy.
Hey, we'll walk over there and use your finger to show us that, or use a pointer.
Pointer. Oh.
You do like I do. You point at the screen.
Pointer. Oh. Anyhow, you see the interesting thing, and it will come back. I'll show you later on. Eh? But what is interesting here is this is a lot of illegal money. Yeah. Here comes the generic tower. Repetition of the and
generic because he doubles.
and then
wait a minute. This is very important because if it had been exactly the same height, if it had been a twin, it would not be generic. So the effort is to make it look like it's part of a indiscriminate field, one among many.
Yeah.
When in fact it's built as a twin tower, and so the idea I think that Peter's trying to get at is that there's some effort to subordinate the repetition so that it's not part of doubling, not part of a twin tower, and then to set it in this island. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is not anymore the Le Corbusier idea, the tower in the park. It's a generic tower in an artificial fake land. Yeah.
But the funny thing is, it's then totally isolated from the entire field, as if it's a fantasy land.
Yeah, exactly true.
So it's not a fantasy land that's ideal. It's a fantasy land that's sort of irreal.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's interesting.
Yeah,
and
no, I love it.
It's in Istanbul.
Just to know, I love this stuff. Then so what came out now is basically.
But by the way, it's not built.
Oh no, this is built.
No, it can't because.
It's built in Istanbul.
Where is it? Where are these red trees?
Yeah, they are. They're there.
They're not built.
It's not Photoshop.
They're plastic.
It's not Photoshop.
But go back one, will you? Okay, so this is in Atlanta, and your point is that this plinth is somehow on the highway?
You see, the highway is basically a state property on a private car park. Yeah. So here, the buildings you see built. Yeah. I mean,
here, come show me. I don't see it. We don't see it. You've gotten to where you see stuff we don't see. Oh, I see.
But this is a public road, yeah? And so these buildings are not constructed on the land, they're constructed on.
Yeah, because there's not enough room.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying in the politics of ownership and things like that. In the politics of ownership, yeah, that is a diagram, yeah, that I have seen is belongs to the diagram that I showed before, yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I think it's the station area.
Oh, I see. It's one of the train stations.
I mean, just that you understand, so what I have done now is, and this is some of the research project, is to take now these kind of diagrams and accelerate them as projects. Yeah. So this is, for example, one where the plinth becomes the replacement of the city grid. Yeah. Produces all the autarkic entities from last year, I think, John, and then reproduces kind of the generic city above. This is then the idea of this fake plinth with the generic tower, and that is the kind of the mountain. But what I conclude is if we know that diagram that dominated, let's say, even today, the culture of our production, meaning there is something like the grid as a generic entity, to which all individual desires can be withdrawn, then I would argue that today the diagram turns around, and that is that we live within the generic towers and we produce the money for a kind of, could be called fake, real. So this is, let's say, what I want to end up. which is a little bit the conclusion of our last year research project, yeah? That when the left one, was the city of the captive globe, then this is the city of the financial capital. So this is the idea that I found interesting, that there is a reversal model, yeah, that it's not anymore the governance that produces within the infrastructure, our imagination of different lives. No, we have the same lives and we produce this kind of fake landscape underneath. That's a little bit the kind of idea. I just want to say that there is a new diagram emerging.
I understand your desire for there to be a new diagram emerging. And by the way, I understand...
Yeah, who cannot be driven by this desire?
And I can also understand your sense that there's evidence of a proto-new diagram at work. I mean, every time you show a picture, you see it. I don't believe yet it's congealed and you've dissected it out. But let me go back and ask you a couple of questions. Can you go back to the China thing? So clearly this building and this building, and probably these buildings, this building and this building definitely predate this. Would everybody agree with that? Okay. That means this is the front of this building. Okay. So this is the back of this building. Normally you would never create a concave enclosure space and then have this be the back of it. So you would normally want that to be the back. But this gives you another kind of diagram of an anonymous way of producing a courtyard. I want everybody to see this. This is a better contemporary courtyard than an acknowledged courtyard. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Like, yeah. Don't do this. This is a bad thing to do. Acknowledge the public space. Produce a sense of enclosure. Produce a sense of identity. Do this on purpose. Okay, that's part of what you're saying. That's why this works so well. That's why this doesn't matter. The front and backness of this doesn't matter. That's why this is weak. You can learn a lot from looking at this and understanding that this requires not ironic distancing, just distancing. If you make it ironic, then the irony returns to reinforce the existing dominant narrative of stable sobriety. So does everybody understand how to read these things?
I think that's it. I think it's very important that this is really, I don't mean this ironic, yeah?
Yes, I know you don't. And so, but in order to get everything that's at work here, you have to understand how everything is contributing to this being at work. And even the slightest change in this lets it slip back into a form of witticism or irony or cynicism, which isn't at work here. And that's when you go back through those projects, I think that's why Peter is entitled to say there's something like a new diagram. Now, go to this. So the captured globe was the first acknowledgement that late capitalism, not meaning late at the end of its life, but capitalism thriving much longer into history than it ever should have, and probably much longer to go than anyone ever imagined, had given a rise to two things. One is the capacity of its own success, but the ability to continue not only to nourish individual desire in a certain kind of individuality, adequate to keep insurrection, the 30s kinds of labor movements, the sense of being ill-used by capitalism's major problem was to stop the group of people, the proletariat as it might once be called, from feeling so ill-used and using militant suppression in that ill use that they couldn't sustain their power ranges. And so they did all sorts of stuff. They produced basically a middle-class bourgeoisie that was infantilized in their reasonable lifestyle. So this is a picture of capitalism's technique of success. Everyone has an island of desire in a grid, and nevertheless, so they're subordinated to the same forces, but they're subjugated by infantilization. So if you read in 1810 de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, this is an incredible book written by a journalist from France. Just after the democracy is a form of democracy is put into place in France, which is still in the place, even though it fell apart twice. So democracy in France is a democracy, meaning everyone in France is responsible to subordinate their individual interests and their personal religions. You know, it's why you can't wear a religious outfit to school, because you are first and foremost a French citizen before you are entitled to religious freedom. You're entitled to religious freedom, but you're not entitled to display your religious freedom at the cost of anybody else. So a democracy is a form of behavior that if you're a member of that situation, you are responsible too. We don't have a democracy. We have a Republican electoral system supported by a Bill of Individual Rights. So what we have are a set of freedoms. So we can do whatever we want as long as we have a set of laws and a right to elect people according to a Republican government. We have a Bill of Rights: right to assemble, right to bear arms, right to freedom of speech. So what de Tocqueville argued is that our form of government would produce greater mercantile freedom, much more profit, but inevitably, as we got wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, freedoms infantilize. The more freedom you have, in other words, if you don't have to behave well according to principles of mature responsibility in a democracy, if all you have to do is obey the law and make sure you don't, then you're entitled to any freedom you want. Your freedom, you get to act like Trump. You get to act like Jeff, particularly Jeff drunk. You get to act like any spoiled brat you want. And that's exactly what he predicts in 1810, is that the problem with America is that wealth inevitably infantilizes. And he said what America will teach us is that we're going to have to learn one day, how does a society grow wealthy and powerful and not have it automatically infantilize? And it was, this is by a journalist, 2 volumes. You have to read it. It's fantastic. And he also says the hope for France is none, because commitment to a democracy as increasing diversity will never be able to be maintained without force. And so this is that picture, and this picture perfectly expressed, with cynicism. This is a very cynical picture and a very optimistic picture of New York. This is the New York grid. If you want to watch something fantastic, there's this comedy show that I accidentally, when I've got nothing else to do, I watch comedy shows called Happy Face. It's this guy from Idaho, place of 1,000 people. Face looks just like Howdy Doody. Perfectly nice, good-looking guy, and he comes in and he says, I moved to New York because I heard all this stuff. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. And so he moved to New York and said, any idiot can make it there. That's the point of New York. You go there, and if whatever you are, a heroin addict, a junkie, a robber, no wonder there's 8 million people there. You land in New York, and what's the big deal? I come from a town of 1,000. If you move to that town, and you're not like that 1,000, you're not, and the next day, no one can find you. And this is the most amazing joke. This was the most amazing. I never heard of this comedian my whole life. For 16 minutes, I'm calling every one of my friends. You have to watch this guy. You have to watch this guy. You have to watch it. And I only made it 16 minutes. It's the funniest damn thing. And it's so perfect about, New York is this. You're a juggler. Let's say you're a gay, lesbian, dope-smoking, pedophilic juggler who likes to juggle body parts of his victims. It'll be 30 years before you get caught. And if you do it in Chicago, it takes a little less time, like your Jeffrey Dahmer. It takes 20 years. You know? So go to the next slide. Now these are beautiful. Go back. These are promises. These are sophisticated. Go back to one. Actually, this is the best one. This is beautiful, but they are regressions. You keep making promises. Go forward. So here's your problem is, look. Yeah, this one right here. So these people, this is Happy Land. This is basically the Hard Rock Cafe. Is that right? Like, you go to work. You don't have to leave your tower. What's the point of leaving your tower? Because you're just going to go to this one, or just going to go to this one. Right? Home, office, why leave? It's all the same. And then you go to the Hard Rock Cafe, and everybody's the same. So this diagram you're trying to draw, which is actually absolutely well instantiated, and it can't be fake.
No, that might be,
I'm not criticizing that. What I'm just saying is,
but fake means this. What has been, in the history, what you could call public, yeah? There's a history in which that public, either for the Greek, yeah, was the idea to be everything not biologically needed, yeah? Basically, food, money, and all that stuff, basically is in the home. And then all the rest, you do within the public, yeah? Then I think within the 18th century nation state, what happens is that suddenly through making taxation, making what is called the householding suddenly, yeah, this is a Hannah Arendt argument, a national householding, yeah? Things from the public realm, from the private one moves towards the public, yeah? And I think what we have today is, in the moment that everything is public, everything is instrumentalized to the means of making profit, yeah, or making capital, yeah. I think that's what I meant by the word fake. Fake is not anymore that there is a division, yeah, to another kind of life. It's everything today is within the same modes of capitalism. Yeah? The house, your behavior, your restaurant, your.
Well, let me let's just set this up, and then I think you guys need to get in the conversation. What I think is the way I work, and I was talking to Ellen about this, is I don't find it productive for me to use given formulas or a body of arrived knowledge and then see if I can fit the world into it. For me, if I look around and I measure stuff and it measures out according to familiar regimes, formulas, diagrams, then I assume that what I'm measuring is going to be well understood by those formulas. So I need to find something that's changed, some new, like let's say digital production or some new situation that's come. Like it would be silly to say social media by itself, but social media is clearly something you have to take into account. So the tradition, a tradition which is distinguished between reorganizations of society has been to distinguish societies that are evolving or societies that are undergoing revolution. And so the forces of revolution and the speed of revolution and the way they cause bodies of populations to behave, to live differently, were easily distinguished for a long time between evolving, because economic evolution, technological evolution was slow. Mm-hmm. So today, evolutionary forces are fast and radical and disruptive. So social media, digital communications, those are evolutionary forces that are operating with the same kind of hostility, aggressiveness, capacity to make changes as traditional revolutionary forces. So if you were to try to make a socio-political, economic diagram of change that was, you know, so like if you were to write Virilio and talk about perpetual war, you would not be able to describe today, because we are in a state of perpetual war that has no warlike quality. Does that make any sense? Do you understand what I'm talking about? So you can't draw these diagrams and you can't posit these relationships until you can figure out where in the formula this new kind of behavior began. Now, I can give you an example. Helmholtz in 1868 derived or developed the concept of energy. So there is no physics formula up until that time, not even Newton, that used the notion of energy. So it was stuck. It had force, it had mass, it had motion, it had velocity. But until Helmholtz came up with just a device, it was just a record-keeping device. He didn't know that energy existed. It was just a kind of way to keep a record. And so he developed this concept of energy, and then physics just got blown away as people said, well, there really is such a thing as energy, you know. So we need to have a way to account for, in these diagrams, all the point is, you have found, I would say, the prima facie evidence in that stuff you show, and everybody else is showing it at the same time. I got a slide in the New York subway the other day, and there's this one sign that says, points this way, it says out, and there's a sign right next to it that points, it says down. And I just wonder, every day somebody gets off that subway, they see a sign that says down and out. And I'm thinking, now if you see that enough times in your life and you keep thinking, okay, my choices are down and out. In 3 or 4 generations, you think, okay, there's some depressed people for you. I mean, sometimes you either make jokes about it or you somehow or another. That's why you have to watch this show, so that somebody tells you that the thing you've been taking for granted your whole life, there's something else going on with all that stuff. So what you need to do is slow down. You need to diagram, you need to try to diagram those situations, you and your students, not just make those projects that are so provocative, but diagram the existing situations in the most accurate terms you can, giving your current diagrammatic technique. And what you're going to discover is there's something missing. And it's whatever that missing thing is, whatever factor that's in there. It may be psychological, it may be economic, it may be something in there. And you're going to need that, or else you're not going to, so it's not going to be a big discovery. It's going to be a small realization of some factor. I keep thinking it's new property, that we are producing new property at an incredible rate of speed.
I think this is one thing. First, I think what you said before is interesting, that, you know, what I consider here is private property goes on private property, yeah? But that private property is not anymore human, it is like everything. So the state behaves as a, you know, it is interesting, the state behaves as a private property, the individual, you know. So there is one thing that I see in these projects, yeah, that private property, you know, is onto private property, yeah, and not anymore a state property, because the state property in itself, yeah, behaves as a private company, yeah. So that's, I think, to me, where some of these diagrams relate to, yeah, to other means of money, yeah, and other means of ownership, or at least in a larger background. Because, for example, of course I have no evidence, but what I've really found intriguing when I reread with some of my students about the idea of the garden city model. Yeah? Now, what the garden city was, it's strangely enough, you know, forget the garden and all this stuff. Yeah? What it really was about is bringing two ideas, Kropotkin's, Russians autonomy idea, and Protestant capitalist things together. I mean, it was in principle it produced a new form of model, which is called in European terms, called associative or ownership. Yeah, you collectively own something. So I'm just saying, I know there is no evidence. The only thing what I've found interesting or speculate on, is if you cannot understand anymore really the world, the financial patterns, if you cannot stand outside of them, to be able to recognize, my idea is to reading through a city, like for example, Koolhaas might have done in Delirious New York or whatever, to read within there a diagram. That's the idea.
The techniques are, listen, I hate to use Trump as an example, but it's such an easy example. A more complicated example would be something like this. There's bills that are being discussed about drug companies. There's one guy you can vilify because he's the head of a drug company, but the people that are fighting can contribute money through PACs and all sorts of ways, and you can't figure out who's fighting it. So it's easy to stop the bill because you can identify the one person that's putting a lot of money into it because he's selling drugs, and then you demonize him. But all the people that don't want to stop it, which are all the insurance companies and stuff, they can funnel their money in such a way that you can only say the big drug companies are supporting this, and or the big insurance companies are supporting it, but there's no way to actually trace that money. So it becomes complicated. But there's one guy on this planet who has made himself the arbiter of claiming something is fake news because he's just said it so many times. And that's Donald Trump. And then yesterday or 2 days ago, he said, federal government response in Puerto Rico, 10 out of 10. So he's declared the federal government response in Puerto Rico perfect. He's announced that as his own evaluation of the federal government response as news. So he did two things. He produced the property of fake news, and then he produced himself as the arbiter of that property. And then instead of paying the $90 billion we need to pay to save these people and doing anything about it, he just declared the federal response perfect. And that is the end of the situation. And so all this effort of these two senators to try to produce one person in charge, it's over. And so that is a form, those are property productions. That's a form of fungible capital. He's not lying. He's saving the United States government $90 billion. It's a business move, I mean, I hate to think about all of it. He doesn't believe Puerto Rico's a state. You know why? It's not a state. I mean, they don't vote. I hate the whole thing, but you have to be able to diagram that. You have to figure out how is so much capital being produced that's not accountable as money or cash or a fungible asset or goodwill. And a lot of this is now at the level of fiction production or it's narrative production. And it's also true, you and I both know, y'all don't know what the derivative markets are, but between 1993 and 2007, virtually all the building in the United States, the only reason for it was to produce accountable mortgages so that the derivative markets could be supported. So $135 trillion worth of new property was created by the actual production of about $10 trillion of real estate that nobody gave a shit about. But it was a big deal to produce $135 trillion of real property, but nobody knew where it was and it's just the greatest production of wealth in the history of mankind. But nobody knew what it was or where it was or who had any right. It was just debt accounting, by the Black-Scholes formula. And in order to do that, they had to basically build 0.08% of it which is the factor they needed. So they needed 0.08% in real construction of junk all over the world. And no bank knew what they were holding or not holding, but they knew the total amount of it, and that was real stuff. And we're still, by the way, just thriving our ass off on that gigantic amount of money. Don't kid yourself. That was a fantastic thing that happened. It also brought the world to within 2 days of totally collapsing. They had to just admit the global financial system is a fiction. They just finally had to admit it. And because the banks just say, I don't care, I may have fake money, but I'm not going to lend it to anybody. And so I don't know if you know this, we put out $13 trillion in debt, and it took us 2 years. China put out $190 billion in 2 weeks. You have to read what China did. I mean, 20 million people were put out of work in 2 weeks. And in order to stop their financial collapsing immediately, they took their entire cash reserve and dumped it into the market. And, I mean, you can go to NPR and read his story. I mean, Xi did this, which is, by the way, now he has his own Chinese theory. It's called Xi's thought. It was just indoctrinated last week. So there's Mao's book, there's Deng Xiaoping's theory, and there's now Xi's thought. Okay, I can just do this forever. But this is your life. I mean, and by the way, it does make a difference because how you build, how things feel and look. You don't need to become an accountant and you don't need to become a theorist, but you are a player in this in a big way. So, a big way, big way. You know, you're the comedian in a certain sense. You know, you may be the tragic comedian, you may be the sad clown, you may be the singer that sings sad songs or happy songs, but you're the reason people live. I just want you to understand this, is they don't live to make more money, they live to spend the money. And you're the reason, and so how they get involved in that is what money is useless until you can move it. Here's how, I'll tell you what, go outside and don't drink any water for 2 weeks, till you're just at the verge of dying of thirst. Then go get a $50 bill and go out and look for a drink machine and try to see if you can get your thirst slaked with that $50 bill. You'll understand what it means that money has no value till you can put it into motion. Okay? So you have to understand, you got to keep money moving because money doesn't mean jack shit until it's moving. And your job is to operate in the world of the eco-ecology of desire, material and matter desire. And that's just if there's not enough desire, you got to go produce it. So when was that great economist at Harvard? He was saying this in a bad way, but he was saying all we are now is made-up desires. What's his name? John Kenneth Galbraith. You know, Galbraith was saying all the stuff we go out and spend and waste our money on, we don't want or really need it. It's just companies have made us think we want it and need it. Thank God, I'm saying. You know, thank God everything comes in 5 colors, and I'm not happy unless I have all 5. So, more colors. Thanks.
Thank you.